Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we're going deep on a book that really got me thinking. It's called Hoodwinked.
Oh, yeah, I know that one.
Yeah, it's by John Perkins, and it's about what he calls predatory capitalism.
Hmm.
And so we're going to kind of unpack how that system works, what the impacts are,
Yeah.
and if there's any path toward a more just and sustainable model.
Well, one of the things that makes Perkins' book so interesting is that it's not all just theory.
Right.
He brings in his own firsthand experiences.
Okay.
And this is where it gets a little wild. He describes his past career as an economic hitman.
An economic hitman. What is that? Like something out of a spy movie?
Well, sort of. Perkins says his job was to persuade developing countries to take on huge loans,
Okay.
loans they couldn't possibly repay. And he claims these loans ended up benefiting mostly big corporations and U.S. interests,
Oh, I see.
leaving those countries stuck in a cycle of debt.
Okay, that's definitely not the economics I learned in school.
Right. But before he really dives into all the ins and outs of what he calls predatory capitalism, he gives this powerful example, Iceland's economic boom and bust.
Yeah.
And what's striking is that it happened in a developed nation, not a developing one.
Right, right.
It kind of challenges our usual assumptions about where these things occur.
He describes Reykjavik's Avenue of Broken Dreams, all these sleek, modern office buildings, but completely empty.
Yeah, it's this eerie visual, isn't it?
Oh, yeah.
Of like, what happens when a booming economy suddenly collapses?
It's a chilling image for sure.
And Perkins argues that what happened in Iceland reflects this wider pattern of exploitation.
Okay.
He draws parallels to his own experiences in places like Indonesia, Nigeria, and Colombia,
Oh, wow.
where he says he was involved in promoting those unsustainable development projects.
I remember that story he tells about the Alcoa aluminum smelter in
Oh,
Iceland.
yeah, the one with the trolls, right.
Exactly. So Alcoa builds this huge smelter needing a ton of energy, like 10 times more than Iceland's first aluminum plant.
Wow.
And to get that energy, they had to dam a river, which flooded this area the size of Manhattan.
Jeez.
And get this, the area was known for its unique ecosystems.
Oh, no.
It was even on an earthquake fault line.
Wow, that's a recipe for disaster.
Yeah.
You know that anecdote with the trolls? It really highlights the environmental concerns that often get pushed aside when people are just chasing economic growth. Right?
Yeah.
It also kind of foreshadows a major theme in the book, that allure of easy money
Right.
and how it can lead to decisions that are, well, not so sustainable in the long run.
Both economically and environmentally.
Exactly.
So let's get into Perkins's concept of predatory capitalism. What exactly does he mean by that?
Well, he describes it as a system that's all about privatizing resources,
Okay.
giving corporations a lot of unchecked power.
Right.
And this is a big one, using debt as a tool of control.
Okay, so how does that all work?
Well, Perkins actually points to Milton Friedman as a key figure in this model.
Milton Friedman, the Nobel Prize-winning economist.
The one and only.
I wouldn't normally associate him with predatory practices, though.
Right, and that's where it gets interesting. So Perkins contrasts Friedman's monetarist theories,
Okay.
which advocate for limited government intervention, with Keynesian economics, which supports governments stepping in, during economic downturn.
Right, to stabilize things.
Exactly. So Perkins suggests that this emphasis on deregulation and focusing on short-term profits, which became really prevalent, especially after Reagan was elected, that paved the way for the kind of corporate greed and excess that ultimately led to things like, the 2008 financial crisis.
Okay, I'm starting to see the connection.
Yeah.
He contrasts this with the post-World War II era, which had a lot more government investment and a greater sense of social responsibility.
Right. It was a different climate back then.
So now Perkins gets into the role of debt, and he argues that it's not just an economic issue.
Yeah, it's about control, too,
Control.
both on a personal level and a national level. He even brings up Ecuador's refusal to honor its national debt.
Really?
Yeah. So the president at the time, Rafael Correa, was an economist himself. He argued that those loans had been taken out by dictators who were pressured by institutions like the World Bank and the IMF.
Oh, wow.
So Correa saw those loans as a form of modern-day enslavement.
Wow.
And he refused to let Ecuador be burdened by what he considered to be illegitimate debt.
So he's basically saying they were tricked into taking on these loans.
Yeah, that's his argument. And Perkins draws parallels to the situation here in the U.S.
Like with the subprime mortgage crisis.
Exactly. People were taking on more debt than they could handle, often because of predatory lending practice.
Right, right. Those adjustable rate mortgages, that seemed like a good deal at first.
Yeah, and it wasn't just individuals. Perkins argues that entire countries were being pushed into this debt trap.
Through those structural adjustment programs, or SAPs,
Sure.
right?
Yes. Those are the programs imposed on developing nations, often with pretty devastating consequences.
Okay.
I mean, these programs often force countries to privatize their resources, cut social spending, and basically open themselves up to exploitation by foreign corporations.
So it's kind of a double whammy.
Yeah, exactly.
Mm.
Perkins actually uses this powerful image from a silent film to illustrate the human cost of this debt trap.
Mm.
It shows this farmer, you can see the desperation on his face
Oh, wow.
as he's forced to take out a loan and sign these papers. And the banker, he's portrayed as this predatory figure.
I see.
He's not just owning the farmer's land,
Right.
but also he's looking at the farmer's daughter.
Oh, geez.
It's that classic story of exploitation.
Yeah.
You know, the wealthy and powerful manipulating debt
Right.
to take what they want from the vulnerable.
Yeah. It's a stark reminder that the pursuit of profit can sometimes come at a very high human cost.
Exactly.
So Perkins argues that these tactics may have been used in developing countries. But the U.S. wasn't immune to this shift toward using debt as a means of control.
That's right.
He points to things like the decline of workers' rights, stagnating wages, and the rise of personal debt here in the U.S. as evidence of this broader trend. It's like he's saying those same forces at play in Ecuador were also operating in a different form
You're right.
right here at home.
It's definitely something to think about. And then there's his analysis of how the U.S. economy shifted from manufacturing to financial services.
Yeah, like with Jack Welch and his transformation of General Electric.
Right. Welch was hailed for making GE leaner and more profitable, but Perkins sees it as a symptom of this move away from producing actual goods, tangible things,
Yeah, yeah.
and toward, well, financial manipulation.
Interesting. So he's basically saying that we've become more focused on making money from money
Exactly.
rather than making things.
He calls it trinket capitalism.
Trinket capitalism. What does that even mean?
It's where the focus is all about marketing and selling often unnecessary goods.
Right, right.
Instead of producing, essential things that people actually need.
I remember Chuck Noble, that ex-general that Perkins worked with.
Yeah.
He was really worried about this trend of producing junk, especially as he was seeing all these cheap imported goods flooding Argentina back in the 80s. It's like he had this premonition that this shift away from manufacturing would eventually backfire.
It's an interesting observation because Nodal embodies this kind of contradiction.
How so?
Well, he's a strong supporter of American industry, and military strength. But at the same time, he's deeply troubled by this growing reliance on imports and the decline of American manufacturing. It's as if he sees the seeds of decline being sown.
Oh, I see.
Even as the U.S. is celebrating its economic dominance.
That's a really insightful point. It's like he's sensing this underlying fragility even in a time of apparent prosperity.
Exactly. And, that brings us to another key part of Perkins' argument, the whole idea of deregulation and how it had some pretty disastrous consequences.
Yeah, he really pushes back against the idea that less regulation always means better outcomes. Like, he uses the Enron scandal and that California energy crisis as examples.
Right, those are perfect examples. The Enron case, with all those shady off-the-books partnerships and the accounting tricks they used, it shows how when there's not enough oversight, corporations can really get away with risky behavior.
And then the California energy crisis, where companies like Enron were accused of, manipulating energy prices to drive them up.
Right. It shows how deregulation can actually hurt regular people in the end.
Yeah, it makes you think, how can we protect ourselves if the systems that are supposed to keep things fair are weakened?
It's a valid concern for sure.
Yeah.
Perkins also goes on to criticize deregulation in the media.
Oh, yeah.
He says it's led to just a handful of huge media conglomerates having all the power, which has stifled diversity of viewpoints and basically molded public perception to benefit those in power.
So it's not just about economics, it's about controlling information.
Right. And ultimately, it's about controlling the narrative.
Exactly. Now, tying this back to the bigger picture, Perkins argues that this push for deregulation happened alongside a cultural shift.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
He talks about this rise of the corporate superstar and how excessive wealth became glorified.
And he uses examples like Dennis Kozlowski, the Tyco CEO, who was known for that extravagant
Oh,
spending.
yeah, like that $6,000 shower curtain he bought.
Right, and who could forget that vodka-spewing ice sculpture of Michelangelo's David at his wife's birthday party?
It's almost funny in a way, but it really reflects this trend of CEOs making tons of money while average workers are barely getting by.
Absolutely.
Right.
Perkins contrasts this with what they used to teach in business schools, fiduciary responsibility. He's basically saying that ethical leadership has declined and that the pursuit of personal gain has come at the expense of the common good.
He points to Jack Welch, the former CEO of GE, as a prime example of this shift, right?
Oh, he's really critical of Welch.
Yeah.
Welch got a lot of praise for boosting GE's profits. But Perkins sees him as a symbol of this cutthroat, short-term thinking that ultimately hurt the U.S. economy in the long run. He focuses on how Welch prioritized financialization and those drastic cost-cutting measures,
Yeah.
arguing that those moves led to job losses and the decline of American manufacturing.
He even mentions how Welch fought against environmental regulations back in the 70s when GE was dumping all those toxic PCBs into the Hudson River.
It's a perfect illustration of how profits can sometimes outweigh concerns for the environment and public health. Those decisions have consequences.
Definitely. Yeah, and it's not just about the bottom line.
No, not at all.
Now this brings us to China. Perkins spends a good chunk of the book talking about China's economic transformation. It seems like he's both impressed by their rapid growth and how they've lifted so many people out of poverty, but also kind of wrestling with whether China's model is a viable alternative to the predatory capitalism he's criticizing.
Yeah, it's interesting how Perkins sees China adapting capitalism to their own unique situation. He notes that their collectivist culture has led to a different understanding of capitalism, one that emphasizes the group's well-being over individual wealth.
So it's not just a straight copy of Western capitalism.
No, not at all. He talks about this idea of a market economy with socialist characteristics, where the government plays a big role in directing development and making investments in infrastructure.
He highlights their emphasis on long-term planning, which is something he says is missing in the short-term thinking he criticizes in the U.S.
Exactly.
Yep.
He's also intrigued by their focus on environmental issues.
Yeah.
He sees China's investment in renewable energy as a potential model for other countries that are dealing with climate change.
That makes sense. He doesn't ignore the challenges China faces, though, like all the pollution they created during their rapid industrialization.
Oh, absolutely. He even talks with some Chinese MBA students who seem really determined to tackle those environmental problems.
Oh.
They get it. They understand that economic growth can't come at the cost of sustainability.
Yeah, that's a crucial point. It's almost like Perkins views China as this giant experiment, trying out a different way of doing things.
Right, but he doesn't go as far as saying their model is perfect or that it could be easily adopted by other countries.
Okay, I see. So this leads him to maybe the most important part of the book, where he calls for a complete transformation.
A real paradigm shift.
He argues that the current economic model just isn't sustainable, and he lays out his vision for a new kind of economy.
He introduces these concepts of green markets and good stewardship, highlighting organizations like Green Festivals and Oxfam America.
Oh yeah, I've heard of those.
They're promoting ethical and sustainable practices.
That's cool. He talks about how consumer demand for ethically produced goods and services is growing.
Yeah, and he compares the Otavalo market in Ecuador,
Okay.
where locally made crafts are valued, to the mass-produced stuff that comes from sweatshops in those globalized production chains.
Yeah, it's like we've lost that connection to the people who make the things we buy.
Exactly. It's become all about getting things as cheaply as possible.
But Perkins doesn't just criticize. He points to real examples of people and organizations who are working toward this new economy.
He tells that story about the Rainforest Action Network, or RAN, and their campaign against Mitsubishi's deforestation practices.
Yeah, that was a big deal.
He talks about Randy Hayes, the founder of RAN,
Okay.
and how he kept pushing to expose Mitsubishi's harmful logging practices.
It's amazing how they use protests and those hard-hitting ads to get people's attention.
Right. They were targeting Mitsubishi's image, not just their profits.
And it worked. Mitsubishi actually agreed to change their logging practices.
It's a great example of how consumer pressure and activism can make a difference.
Yeah, it shows that change doesn't always come from the top down. It takes pressure from ordinary people.
Perkins argues that each of us plays a part in creating a more just and sustainable world.
So it's not just up to governments or big corporations.
Right. He encourages us to find what we're passionate about and make sure our actions match our values. It's about getting involved in the systems that shape our world, not just buying green products.
And then he brings in this idea of the fifth Pachacudi, that Incan prophecy about cycles of upheaval and transformation.
Yeah.
He links that prophecy to the global crises we're facing today, suggesting that we're at a
A
crossroads.
moment where we have a real chance to create a new era of balance and sustainability.
He uses that observation from the Cuna elder who said that the Panama Canal, which is a symbol of humans controlling nature, has caused division. It emphasizes that we need to find a new way to connect with the environment.
It's like we need to move past this idea of just taking from nature without giving back.
Exactly. And he contrasts the political turmoil in Honduras, where a U.S.-backed coup ousted a president who was challenging corporate interests,
Right.
with the Mamoni Valley Preserve in Panama.
That Maumee Valley Project is a great example of sustainable development, where indigenous communities, NGOs, and private investors are all working together to restore the rainforest and create a new economy based on the forest.
It shows that when people come together with a shared vision for a better future, amazing things can happen.
It really highlights that we have a choice to make. Do we stick with this path of predatory capitalism with all its inequality and destruction?
Mm-hmm.
Or do we embrace a different vision for a more just and sustainable world, even if it means challenging the status quo and demanding something better from the systems that govern our lives?
That choice feels pretty overwhelming, honestly. When you put it that way, it really makes you realize we're not just watching this system play out, we're part of it. But if we actually want to change things, where do we even start?
Perkins reminds us that change usually doesn't happen right away. He brings up the environmental movement as an example. You know how polluted our rivers used to be?
Right.
Or that hole in the ozone layer. Those were huge problems. But thanks to scientists, activists, and just regular people caring enough to do something about it, we actually made some real progress.
So even though things seem kind of bleak, sometimes there's still hope.
Definitely. Perkins argues that cynicism and apathy are the biggest things holding us back. He reminds us that every movement for change starts with people who refuse to just accept things the way they are. Look at that Rainforest Action Network going up against a giant corporation like Mitsubishi. They didn't give up.
Yeah.
And in the end, they got results.
That's a good point. It makes me think, though, Perkins talks a lot about these global issues, but he's writing from an American perspective. How do we balance wanting to make changes here at home with the impact our actions have on the rest of the world?
That's a really important question.
Yeah.
Perkins actually challenges us to think beyond our own borders.
Yeah.
He criticizes that not in my backyard attitude.
Yeah.
Where we might be against something like oil drilling here in the U.S., but we don't care if it's happening in other countries.
Yeah.
He even calls out a friend of his, a dedicated environmentalist.
Really?
Yeah, who supports drilling overseas while opposing it here at home.
That seems kind of hypocritical. Like, it's okay to exploit other people's resources as long as it doesn't affect us directly.
Exactly. And Perkins makes his point that environmental problems don't stop at borders. Climate change, pollution, deforestation, those are global issues. They need global solutions.
So what can we do? Perkins wraps up the book talking about that Incan prophecy, the Pachacudi, about cycles of upheaval and transformation. What do you think he's getting at there?
Well, I think he's saying that we're at a pivotal moment in history. We can keep going down this path of predatory capitalism with all its unfairness and damage, or we can choose to build something new, a system that values sustainability, justice, and the well-being of everyone.
He uses those contrasting examples of Honduras and the Mamoni Valley Preserve, almost like showing us two possible futures, one pretty grim, the other full of hope.
Right. On one hand, you've got Honduras, where corporate interests backed by the U.S. government are undermining democracy and exploiting workers. And then you've got the Mamoni Valley, where indigenous communities are teaming up with NGOs and investors to restore the rainforest and create a sustainable economy. It's powerful stuff.
It really drives home the point that we have a choice to make. So for everyone listening to this deep dive, what kind of world do you want to be part of creating? What are you passionate about? What changes do you want to see?
And remember, you don't have to wait for someone else to lead the way. You can be that change. Support businesses that align with your values. Get involved in your community. Speak up against injustice.
Yeah.
Every action, even the small ones, adds up.
That's a great message to end on. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into Hoodwinked. It's given us all a lot to think about.
It definitely has. And remember, the exploration doesn't have to stop here. Keep asking questions, keep learning, and keep working towards the world you want to see.